Reflective writing assignment part 2. I decided to focus on socioeconomic status in the Nice White Parents podcast. So on this presentation, we're going to go through 4 levels of equity, starting at individual and then going to interpersonal, institutional, and finishing up at ideological. So first and foremost, on the individual level, affluent white parents have the financial resources to actively shape the educational environment of their children and their peers. So an example of this in the podcast, the parents, through financial coercion, were able to convince the school to implement a French immersion program. They pushed this through at the PTA, and they also created their own independent organization for collecting, fundraising, and donating funds. And so obviously they have a leg up on their peers on the lower levels of the socioeconomical ladder, because those people might not have the time, money, or energy to advocate for something like this. Moving on, affluent white parents have the necessary time and energy, as I was previously talking about, to give their kids an edge in the admissions process. So in the podcast, it talks about how in order for your kid to be accepted into one of the big 3 middle schools, they had to jump through a lot of hoops to make themselves noticeable as an applicant. And so this included attending school tours, acquiring letters of recommendation, achieving high test scores. And so affluent white parents have the time necessary to actually attend these school tours. If you're working 2 jobs, or if you just have one parent who's working overtime to take care of you, they might not have the necessary time and energy to go to a school tour. Furthermore, one of the ways in which affluent white kids were able to acquire these letters of recommendation were through summer camp counselors, and it costs money to send your kid to something like that. And so individuals on the lower end of the socioeconomical ladder might find it more difficult to acquire those letters of recommendation. And finally, test scores, like hiring tutors, can give your kid a big edge in test taking. So having the financial means to do that is a big bonus. So individual quote, consequently, I argue that multicultural education has become a victim of this process of hegemony. As such, the forms we actually find multicultural education taking today are of an ideological safe nature. So I chose this quote because the affluent white parents, through financial and social coercion, were able to push through the French immersion program. And although this might be considered a form of multicultural education, it's education in a second language. It's in a language that they chose, that they feel is on their level, as opposed to potentially learning the language or structuring a school which offers classes in the language of their immigrant peers, people on the lower end of the socioeconomical ladder who might speak Spanish or a different language like that. Instead, they chose French. So moving on to interpersonal level, affluent white parents have a lot of power over teachers, administrators, and lawmakers. Their preferences hold outsized importance in the design of the educational system. So in the podcast, it mentioned that immigrant, Black and Latino, and other minority and marginalized families protested in large numbers about the poor conditions in their public schools. And at a similar time, a smaller cohort of affluent white parents took to the streets to protest. And despite the um, extreme number differences between these two groups. The group that was actually able to influence, pressure, and persuade, and potentially even intimidate the school system was the latter group of affluent white parents. Um, and talking about the design of the educational system, I think going back, the French immersion program is once again a perfect example of this. Um, they wanted it to be in French, and so that's what they got. They were not taking into account the wants, needs, preferences, desires of those people. Very often, as I said, immigrant, Black, Latino, etc. families in the lower levels of the socioeconomical ladder. Moving forward, and this is very connected, low-income, often immigrant and colored families feel that their voices aren't being heard. Their cultural and linguistic backgrounds are undervalued in the educational system. So, same thing. Instead of their culture, their linguistic abilities being put at a position of importance within the school system, they're essentially just thrown to the wayside as unimportant. So, interpersonal quote: the assumption follows that people of color lack the social and cultural capital required for social mobility. As a result, schools most often work from this assumption in structuring ways to help disadvantaged students whose race and class background has left them lacking necessary knowledge, social skills, abilities, and cultural capital. So I think a perfect example of these type of interpersonal interactions at play would be when that lady at the French gala just approached, I think it was a teacher or maybe a parent, and began to talk about the benefits of being bilingual, how it increases connection and opportunity, and how it's so amazing to go to Paris and be able to speak French with the native French there, without ever thinking that her interlocutor, that parent, was also bilingual, but in Spanish. And so, um, there's this assumption that she made that her social and cultural capital, in the form of being able to speak French, was superior. It was an automatic assumption. And then her interlocutor, who spoke Spanish and was from a, a different race than her, and she was also on a different level of socioeconomics. So on the institutional level, affluent white parents have historically, and still largely do today, held outsized political power. This has allowed them to heavily influence where schools are located. So when integration was first beginning to take place in New York, they had to decide where the school was going to be located. And the immigrant Black and Latino families wanted it to be placed in their neighborhood, their Gowanus houses. However, affluent white parents wanted it to be placed closer to their neighborhood. So as a sort of a compromise, they decided to place it in a friend zone. However, and this is moving on to the second point of school choice, instead of going to that school at the last minute, they pulled it out and decided to go to a different school, forcing these poor Black and Latino students, mostly, to have to walk extra blocks for no reason whatsoever. So they were able to use their political power to move the school, and then they were able to use their position in society as the principal beneficiaries of school choice to choose to go to someplace else. And so poor families often don't have this choice. If they disagree with the way a public school is being run, they might not have the financial means to send their kid to a private school or to send their kid to a school long away, which requires a bigger commute. And so affluent white parents who have the financial, time, and energy requirements to do these things are the principal beneficiaries of school choice. So moving on, an institutional quote. For instance, because some schools are well endowed in terms of materials and resources, the students in these schools have multiple means to help them learn. On the other hand, schools that serve students living in poverty tend to have fewer resources and frequently employ inexperienced teachers, and thus they provide fewer opportunities for student learning. And so, this system which affluent white parents have set up, in which some schools, based off of property tax schemes, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and because of the existence of fundraising, donating, PTAs, which I'm not necessarily saying are a bad thing, have created a situation in which some schools have way more materials to teach their students than others. And so it's perpetuating this inequality because affluent white students and people generally on the upper echelons of the socioeconomical ladder are the primary beneficiaries of this system, whereas poor students are often put in a situation where their schools do not have the same level of materials, the same amount of experienced teachers, etc., etc., putting their kids, those students, at a disadvantaged position moving forward. So, ideological level, school choice acceptance, which we've talked about, property-based tax schemes, which I just mentioned, and fundraising and donating allowance. So in all, these policies and the beliefs from which they stem from allow those with money to influence those without. They allow those with money to give their kids a better education than those without money. So for example, property-based tax schemes, richer people live in bigger houses, which are taxed more. And these richer and bigger houses tend to be by each other, and their children tend to go to schools nearby. So obviously, those schools are going to have more income, as opposed to schools in poorer districts of a city, a neighborhood, whatever we're talking about, that are not taxed as much. Their schools are inevitably going to have less money per student. And moving on, we have ingrained cultural superiority of middle class and upper class educational values. So the French immersion program, once again, an amazing example. The introduction of gifted and honors courses. This creates situations where a school may be economically, racially, linguistically diverse, taken as a whole, but there is segregation within the school itself, where what very often occurs is affluent white students are placed within these gifted and honors courses, and poorer, very often immigrant, Black Latino families are left in the other courses, creating a two-tiered system in the school, essentially segregation within the same school. And teaching styles that value order and obedience. So I'm thinking specifically to that school in the basement in the podcast, where everything was very structured, very rigid, very strict, and it did not leave much room for creativity, for expression, and it was very often these poorer individuals who were at this school. And so in all, this leads to a systematic marginalization of low income, often immigrant, Black, Latino, um, minority families. So my quote for this is quite long, so I'm just going to state the numbers. So for a school in Chicago, there's one school that makes about $8,000 that has about $8,000 per student, while another school has about $17,000 per student. The former school is 87% Black and Latino, while the latter school is 90% white. And this, as we have previously mentioned, is because of property tax schemes that have created a situation where affluent white students are receiving over double the amount of money dedicated to them as opposed to their Black and Latino peers. So moving on, it's very much the same situation in Philadelphia, about 9,000 for in the former category and 17,000 for in the latter category. Finally, in the final category for New York School, 11,000 for in the former category and 22,000 for in the latter category. And so in all of these situations, low-income Black and Latino students are receiving approximately half the amount of funds as their white peers. And this stems very much from policies that have an ideological basis. So moving on, I'm going to talk a bit about my lived experiences. So on the individual equity level, my parents sent me to a private Catholic elementary school because they thought that it was better than the public sector ones. So my parents' belief was that private schools provided me a better education than public schools, and that was their belief. And since they had the financial means to send me to a private Catholic elementary school, they took that action. So on the interpersonal level, in high school, I had an Ethiopian friend who I met through my cross-country team. He told me he moved to the US, I believe, when he was like 8 or 9. And his conversational English was excellent. He came to the US not speaking any English whatsoever. He told me he sat in the classroom in elementary school and middle school, like not really even understanding what his teachers and his peers were saying. Like he had to learn English through observations. But despite this, like he was so smart, he pushed through, he learned English. But when it came to taking like English classes and social studies classes and some other classes at high school, like he was encountering some severe difficulties because of the academic language. So I put this on the interpersonal level because his interactions with his teachers, his peers, the school system, with American society in general, did not give him the tools to succeed coming from an immigrant background. And then we did succeed. It was just more difficult for him than someone who was born in the US, growing up speaking English. So moving on to the institutional level, I went to a majority white, and from what I know, I don't exactly have like the statistics, but a financially well-off Olympia High School where I lived. It was like a mile away from my house, so it was like I was firmly in the district. And this is at odds with the more racially and economically challenged schools nearby. So I was doing some research specifically into River Ridge High School, which is over in Lacey. In this school, which is much more ethnically diverse and socioeconomically diverse. They have a lot of students coming from um, economically challenged families, much opposed to Olympia High School, where students' families tend to be relatively well off for the most part. Um, so it's very interesting looking at those statistics. Like the average student at Olympia High School received a lot more money than the average student at Riveridge High School. And there was a racial difference too. Like the majority of students at Olympia High School were white. I believe in the 60% something. And the vast majority of the students at Riveridge High School were um, Latino and Black. So moving on to an ideological level, I took almost all AP classes in high school, and this created a situation where I interacted with the same small group of students throughout essentially the entirety of my high school experience. There were like a few classes that weren't AP, but in my AP classes, it was mostly the same students in every single one. And um, given that the majority of my school was white in the first place, the majority of my classmates were white, so I don't exactly know if it was a racial thing, but my school definitely did have a two-tiered system in which some kids took these AP honors classes and some students took the normal classes. Um, so how to deepen my analysis in the Washington context? Um, so a few things I would do is I would analyze schools in gentrifying neighborhoods. Apparently, Tacoma and Seattle have quite a few gentrifying neighborhoods, so I would be super interested in examining and analyzing those school districts, which contain a lot of um, newly arrived, wealthier, very often affluent white families, and see how they are affecting school curriculum, school direction, you know, school priorities. That'd be something very interesting to look into. I would also um, analyze schools with high immigrant populations, um, see the differences between these schools and schools that contain mostly native born Americans. I would analyze and compare school funding, um, tax income, as well as PTA fundraising with school racial, linguistic, and socioeconomical composition. So going back to my comparison between Olympia High School and River Ridge High School, I'd love to continue this analysis throughout the entire state of Washington and compare and see if schools with mostly wealthier white families, or like if white majority schools have more funding than Black and Latino majority schools, if schools where the majority of students speak English as a first language have more funding than schools where a significant portion of the students don't speak English as a first language, and of course examining like um, socioeconomic composition of the communities who go to each school and how that affects funding. I think that'd be super important to look at. Um, so moving on, analyzing what sort of students are engaging in gifted, honors, AP, and running start classes, seeing once again if there's any connection or correlation along racial, linguistic, and socioeconomical lines, and seeing if there's that like two-tiered type of economic, racial, and linguistic segregation that was talked about a lot in the podcast. And finally, analyze what type of languages are being offered in the classroom and if this reflects our respective communities. Um, I believe in high school, um, the only languages that were offered were French, Spanish, and German. I would love to see if that's consistent across the entire state or if schools with immigrant populations maybe offer those languages. Um, I think that'd be something super interesting to analyze. And so, yes, my citations, and that was my presentation.